Hey everybody, so we're going to go ahead and finish out kind of really the recordings for this module and talk about chapter 10. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And really, again, I'm going to have you fall back on some of the lecture about global and US based wealth and inequality, and that particular lecture that started out this module, because I think that that kind of starts to explain this in a really good way. But before we get too far into this, let's talk about terms. Income is really the cash flow that arrives on a regular basis. So this is going to come from your job, your paychecks. This is going to come from, say, interest from maybe a savings account or a checking account that you have, daily dividends, and inheritance. Certain things like that are going to become your income, and that's usually what you live on. It's what you pay for your stuff day to day on. So that's going to be your food, your mortgage, your rent, things of that nature. And then wealth, which includes really an accumulated assets, such as like your accounts, your savings accounts, your home equity, your stocks, bonds, business ownership, things of that nature. So anything else that can be liquidated into funds, essentially is what you would consider all encompassing your wealth. And again, there are people who don't have significant wealth, or their wealth is again considerably less than others due to historical factors, due to inequality, due to level of education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to kind of get into that. Again, the top 10% of Americans have the vast majority of the wealth. And then if you look at the 51st through the 90th percentile, but the bottom 50% have, like, you can barely see it. And this is as of 2013. And that particular feedback, or that particular graphic, is more updated in some of those videos that I attached for you guys to watch. And then you look at the racial wealth divide. If you're looking at the 400, the Forbes 400 net worth, or the 400 richest Americans, compared with all African American and Latina households, right? So all African American households versus just the Forbes 400 most wealthy people. And so that's 203 2.3 trillion versus 1.5 trillion, and that's for every African American household in the country, versus and a 1.8 for every Latino house in the country. And that's just talking about, again, how extreme that gap is between the two groups. When you talk about the racial gap as of 2019, I wanted to get you some more recent data. Here are some graphics and some really good articles and websites that will kind of go over this. The average family net wealth by race and ethnicity. So you're going to look at white here, and then you're going to look at Black or African American, and then you have your Hispanic or Latino. Now, I will remind you that this does have in your major outliers, right? So this is going to have your celebrities, your quadrillionaires, your billionaires, your all of the very top 1% in there included as well. So you're not going to see the average, maybe in Appalachia, look this dramatic, right? But because the majority of that really top 1% is white, it is essentially talking about, within this graphic, how massively divided that particular wealth is, because there's not 1%ers that would bring it back up to a relative ratio for kind of those other demographics, if that makes sense. Not in the same way. And then if you look at overall economic segregation, and that particular index, and we're going to get more into what that means for cities and counties. I actually think this is in maybe. You're going to see the deep purple is going to be more segregated, and the light blues are going to be less segregated, and really just how this is concentrated along major populations, and especially up the South and East Coast. And those neighborhoods, and just the wealth gap in general, consistently is more and more and more segregated by race. All right, let's get into this other part here, and we're going to get into kind of the meat and the bones of how this happened. So there's several different core links. We're going to go over some of the four main points here, right? The big puzzle pieces, as you would say, and that's kind of why I use this particular thing. We'll get into some graphics about neighborhoods, talk about neighborhoods, and then we're going to talk about the 10 myths that are associated with closing this particular racial wealth gap. All right, so um, history, right? So we know that the historic roots of this country are built on the backs of people of color, and that the majority of the wealth of white Americans, especially down in the South and the East Coast, is really built, well, actually everywhere, let's be honest, is built on the backs of slaves, of migrant farmers, of um, the genocide of indigenous persons, all of these things allotted for the space where these particular racial groups did not have the same capacity to grow wealth or to even have any um, for extended periods of our social time, of our historic period in America. And that whatever wealth, social networking, or however wealth may have been or success had been considered in some of these other groups, say in the groups in Africa that were brought over as slaves, or say in the indigenous groups, or in the um, other less colonialized countries and their immigrants and their groups. Success may not have been just out of extreme wealth in relation to money. Success may have been a good crop. It may have been making sure that you're using a land in sustainable ways. It may have been being able to feed yourselves and your family. Success may have looked significantly different. So, what we valued as wealth might have changed or been different if different demographics were not isolated and ruined by colonialistic processes. All right. So we created residential segregation basically in the process of making specific neighborhoods more predominantly white versus predominantly any other racial category. And this came about through who could own land where and when, and in what places, and that in allotted in and of itself where people were physically located in this country and what that meant. It also different social programs that allotted for maybe previous slaves to own land generally got reversed, and that land would get taken away. Indigenous persons' lands considerably got taken away and consistently get reduced and reduced and reduced and reduced, and are still that process happens. Through racial violence, things like the Tulsa race massacre, where when prominent communities of colors existed, racial violence tended to be very prominent and or to destroy those particular regions, just like it did in what is considered Black Wall Street, was considered the Black Wall Street in Tulsa. And that was essentially where white people went through and consistently caused violence among prominent or upcoming neighborhoods and communities of color in a way that required, well, burnt down wealth, killed numbers of people, scared people into living into much different areas, scared people out of maybe predominantly white areas. And these things had really, really negative impact in the ability to carry wealth or to pass down wealth. Again, racially restrictive neighborhood covenants. So again, preventing the sales of housing of people of color in specific areas, that's going to have lasting impacts. Federal housing authority or discriminative guidelines, including several real estate ventures. We're going to get into that here in a minute. And then really the predominant exclusion of people of color from things like the GI bills, things like the New Deal, when Social Security started, and other just social programs that lifted up white communities in ways that they just didn't for communities of color. And through these processes of violence, of social exclusion, of social expansion projects being limited, it disenfranchised many people from, and most racial groups from acquiring a good amount of wealth and being able to transfer that over to future generations. When we talk about suburbia, federal changes in real estate loans in the 1930s really affected potential home ownership. And those practices locked out African Americans out of really a lot of opportunities. And this was essentially making sure that redlining, which is again color coding maps and ways for loan companies to keep housing segregated and make sure that specific racial groups did not enter white neighborhoods, or any other racial group did not enter white neighborhoods, through the process of limiting or mandating that specific criteria be part of loans. So you had to be able to have history or show history of family that had owned land before, or had had a loan and successfully paid it before. But if you came from descendants of slaves or what have you, you would not have had that paperwork, or even that loans would require you to even show specific kinds of long-term employment, or they would show specific, like they would require you specific levels of education that was not available. They would require you all sorts of just really discriminatory and intentional policies that allowed them to essentially say, well, I'm not doing it because you're Black, I'm doing it because you don't meet this criteria. When really what it was a way to keep Black people from having home loans. And this continues now with certain immigrated groups, because you have to be in the U.S. citizen for so long, et cetera, that leave people very limited on their housing ability and their ability to have home loans to do these things. And then we've talked about gentrification, I believe, before, but we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And that's just the process by which essentially people want to re-up a neighborhood, or they come in and buy really low cost real estate and then flip those houses for much, much more and try to like clean up or make the neighborhood more pretty or what have you. But in doing so, it literally generally brings in younger white groups into areas or neighborhoods of color, and essentially makes their housing or their property taxes at a level in which they cannot no longer afford, and forces people of color who have been in neighborhoods for an extended period of time or even generations at time to leave specific areas due to the fact that they can no longer afford the area now that so much has been done for the property value, or it's been increased so much. And you see this a lot in major cities. You see it less so, but occasionally in rural areas, but it happens much slower in those areas than it does in some of these bigger cities. And then when you talk about real estate, you talk about things like Mission Hills in Johnson County, Kansas, where it's the third richest county in the United States, but it's also almost entirely white. And that has meaning, right? It's showing this very visual representation of the fact that primarily the wealth in this country is held by white individuals. And that's not to say that all white people are wealthy. It's to say that the majority of the wealth is within white communities. And how is this, again, related to historical and present day processes? And that's, again, getting back at this historic relations. And we're going to talk about some of those processes within the real estate industry. Things like blockbusting, where you scare white families out of neighborhoods where people of color have moved into. So trying to steer what populations live in what particular areas. And this still happens today. And then steering people into neighborhoods that were mostly the race similar to themselves. And again, you're still going to see this today. You're also going to see a lot of areas that were once like Harlem's a good example. You also have, and it's not always just particularly communities of color, but it's also queer neighborhoods. It's also places in, say, San Francisco, maybe, where a much more diverse population would have been at another period in time, but because of real estate processes and the market in general, and the overwhelming amount of money that people are paying for pieces of property, what has been created is this inability to keep up with, again, those property values, those property taxes, and then getting essentially less and less and less diverse within those neighborhoods that maybe once were much more diverse communities. Um, you still have neighborhood segregation as often it's measured using a dissimilarity index. We're going to talk about that in the next slide because I've got a bunch of graphics. And the percentage of people who would have to move in order to make a neighborhood more integrated. There we go. In 1940, Kansas City had a dissimilarity index of 88, meaning that 80% of all non-white individuals would have to move in order, like, to another part of the city in order to be more integrated. And today, 8 cities have a dissimilarity index of 80 or above. Now, this data is based on your book, and that is particularly a little bit older information. So I went in and also got us some more information. This is a 2011 diversity report that was in your book about the diversity experienced by each group within their own neighborhood. So whites are going to see more whites. This is how they're going to see. Blacks are going to see whites, blacks, predominantly blacks, Hispanics, etc. And so, right, it's showing how the biggest portion of that particular race is generally in neighborhoods that are associated with that race. That's not to say that, say, Asians don't see a vast majority more diversity than white people do in white-based neighborhoods, okay? I also wanted to get you, because this is a little bit older, this is in 2010. This data is where it looks in 2000. Here you can see in 2010. And then you can look over here, and that's 2013 to 2017. So your average white resident, here's the population or the portion in 2000. Here it is in 2010. And then you could go over here and look that it's 71%, which is not significantly different than where it was 20 years earlier, right? And you can do the same for Black residents, but it just has some data that's a little bit newer. I couldn't find data significantly newer than that. However, this particular group was doing it, I think, every like 4 years or something to that effect. So we should see another one coming out that would have been in 2002. You also see census data that's going to give us more rounded information about neighborhoods, and that stuff should be coming out more frequently. Here is the Louisville or Jefferson County in particular housing neighborhoods. So here's what you're going to see in 1990, where the diversity index is not super great, but you're going to have pockets more so of particular groups, right? They're still very much pocketed. Here, you're going to see a diversity index that is still like this, but there's much more diversity in the neighborhoods, if that makes sense. So you're still going to see a lot more diversity within Louisville, but it's still getting compacted into specific areas, and still specific areas are going to have very, very, very little diversity. And that's just talking about the fact that um, you're really still seeing segregated populations. And then here is going to be your most diverse and more segregated cities among the top 100 most populous US cities. And this is going to be your, the top is going to be your most diverse at a city level, least diverse. Here's your neighborhood levels. Here's your most integrated and most segregated. Okay. So this is just to kind of give you some more information. And this was done, I want to say this is 2019 data. I tried to pull data that was more recent. All right. So here is where wealth, here's, talking about some of the reasons why there's such a big wealth gap. Wealth is primarily within home ownership, and we just talked about all the barriers that come for people of color and have consistently come for people of color when it comes to home ownership. Educational attainment allows you a lot of times that ability to get the jobs that would allow you the income to do these things. Unfortunately, also with that comes a wide amount of debt, which we're going to get into in that American Dream chapter. And that debt to income ratio still has to be what it has to be in order to acquire housing and those particular kinds of equities. And again, the more you have to take out for obtaining your education, the more likely you are to be in student loan debts for longer, the less likely you are to be able to put that wealth into somewhere else. You're going to be paying off that debt first, and maybe forever. Also, you have predatory lending practices. So subprime loans are these really high interest loans that are with super unfavorable conditions. So 18% of mortgages are held by Blacks and Latinos are subprime. So that's almost 20% of the mortgages within those communities. And that's significantly higher than the rates of subprime loans for white persons. You also have subprime loans are really predatory in the sense that they can change very quickly. And they are much more likely to impact your credit in a much more negative way when or if those cannot be paid back at the times in which they're supposed to be paid back, or if those interest rates change and there becomes a significant increase in payment. If those cannot be paid, there have much more higher default rates on them and things of that nature. And then you have predatory lending, so payday loans, pawn shops, check cash services, all of these things you generally see located in areas and communities of color. And that's just because traditional banking has been such a hazard for communities of color for so long, and those banks generally are not in those specific areas. Innovative ideas, one of them that was in the book are these ideas of baby bonds, where every baby is given a savings account when they're born with specific kinds of reparations in mind. And that bond varies according to income level, with poor families getting more. And then when that beneficiary turns 18, they can access these funds for asset enhancing endeavors like purchasing a home or starting a business. But again, these kinds of social services have overwhelmingly, as well as any kind of reparations situation, have overwhelmingly been unsupported in this country. And most of that is because overwhelmingly the people who don't support these processes are white. And because that is still the majority of the voting populace in this country, unfortunately, that still tends to be the people who win out. Now, that's not to say that all white people do not support these measures, and or that really the white people who don't support these measures have an adequate understanding of what they are and what their intended purpose are. It's again talking about having that conversation in a capitalist society where especially white people who are economically struggling, um, can see that they're not struggling due to their race, but struggling due to a system that pits them against other people who are struggling, as opposed to pitting them against the system that is creating that struggle. And we can talk more and more about that as we move forward. And then, okay, so we're going to talk about the 10 myths about closing the racial wealth gap. And a lot of these, again, chime back into that idea of victim blaming that is almost consistent in any kind of social funding or social arguments that provide social services to anyone for any reason. But we're going to get kind of into that. So a greater educational attainment and more work effort on the part of Blacks will close this racial income wealth gap. And again, this denotes two things. One, the cost of education and what attaining education really means for debt and for wealth and etc. It also does not talk about the ways in which the educational system has been inaccessible for an extended period of time for communities of color. And it also is tying back into that blame the person as opposed to the system mentality that's built into capitalism with this whole more work ethic. You just need to work harder. If you just work harder, then you'd be able to get where you want it to be. The problem with that is when you have active measures of barriers to loans, barriers to education, barriers to and extreme amounts of debt that you will have to get into for these things, along with hiring and firing practices and income inequality. None of those things are going to really be realistic conversations if you're talking about only, well, you have to work harder. Well, if you have to work harder and you still make less, then that's not a system that's actually going to close the racial wealth gap. What you're doing is making people work twice as hard for the same amount of impact on their overall wealth, and that's not the same thing as closing a wealth gap. So the racial homeownership gap is the driver of the racial wealth gap. While it is one contributing factor, again, having the conversations about income gaps, having the conversation about educational gaps, the cost of education, the cost of healthcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and all the barriers at every systemic and institutional level impact each other. And so narrowing it down to one is, well, yes, a solution, but it needs to be a solution in conjunction to multiple other solutions, because one system cannot break the entire unequal parts in all the institutions, right? It has to be at every institution, every social level, or you don't end up creating that. You don't end up creating the racial wealth gap or decreasing the racial wealth gap. What you end up doing is putting a stopgap in one particular area, and that will flow over into other areas because other policies, other things will have impacts on that particular area, if that makes sense. And then again, buying and banking, Black will close the wealth gap. And this is going to come back and refers to another one in here. And it's just talking about how, yes, those particular practices are really, really good, but you're only hitting a certain percentage of those communities. And that's because when we looked back at those figures of who owns businesses, it is overwhelmingly not persons of color. And so while yes, it will help those persons of colors that do have access to owning their own business, it is not going to help the entire community. Why? Because the most vulnerable in that community are not going to have access to owning those companies. All right. So Black people saying saving more will close the racial wealth gap. And I'm going to say the same thing about this that I say about closing the income gap and wealth gap just in general for people impoverished. People impoverished can't save money if they can't meet their basic needs with what they make. Period. Full stop. You cannot save money if you cannot meet your basic needs and have excess. with what you make. And that's not a realistic goal for a vast majority of the people in the United States. It is not a realistic goal to continue to tell people to save money that they do not have. All right. And that's where I'm going to stop that. Greater financial literacy will close that racial wealth gap. Again, people understand that they don't have the money to pay the basic needs that they have. They are very literate in that reality. And more often than not, those who have gone without and have to finagle and figure out which bills they can pay which, and which overdraft fees are going to be the most, and which late fees on which bills are going to be the most, and which are the closest to being turned out, play a game of chess in economics that most people that consistently have money are not financially literate enough to do. And so when I say that, by saying that they are not financially literate, is discrediting the fact that these individuals have to be really, really resourceful in order to figure out how to manage what they have, and consistently telling them they're not smart enough to save money is demeaning, and it discredits the massive amount of uh, income inequality and the massive amount of cost of living that is the United States right now. All right. The next one, entrepreneurship will close the racial wealth gap. Again, while yes, it is amazing if we could grow businesses of color, that would be great. And if we could put money into those particular ventures. However, the majority of people in these communities are not looking for entrepreneurship. They're looking for basic needs being met, and we're looking for the ability to maintain a level of job status, of education status that everyone else can achieve, right? Or that white people can achieve, more pointedly. And that's not the same. And so while yes, there are people who want to own businesses who are not able to, that's not the vast majority of the issue. Okay. Emulating successful minorities will close the racial wealth gap. Let's be honest. Most Black men are not going to be Kobe Bryant. So telling them to be Kobe Bryant in order to close the racial wealth gap is not going to be helpful. Okay. You have to have a certain level of skill, luck, social networking that allots you those particular places within the world. And so that would be the same thing as looking at me and being like, well, just emulate Julia Roberts and you'll be good to go. That's great. I do not or have nor want the acting ability that Julia Roberts has. B, I do not have the social network she has. And C, I am never going to make that much in the allotted field that I want to work in and that is needed, right? Not everyone can be actors and lawyers and doctors and entertainers, right? There is a vast majority of jobs that have to get accounted for, and they deserve the right to live in a way that they do not have to know where they can be confident in where their next meal is. They can be confident in the roof of their head and their basic needs, and their and just not just their basic needs being met, but also being able to live a comfortable life economically and otherwise. And that isn't the same thing as saying, here, go be like this person, right? It is saying that, hey, we all should be able to be economically stable. And that does not happen by just promoting the individual people who have made it through specific barriers. Those barriers still exist, despite the fact that a very small, very, 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 very extremely small group has made it through them. Okay, that's not the same thing. All right. I'll get off that soapbox for a minute. Improving soft skills and other personal responsibility will close the racial wealth gap. Again, this is coming back to some seriously negative stereotypes, essentially talking about the fact that in order to be a successful person, in order to be valued or to have worth within an economic market, you should look and appear and act a specific cultural way. And specifically in this culture, that would be a white, Eurocentric, colonialistic way, and give up any kind of cultural diversity, any kind of other religious or social status that may be important to you, and or to carry yourself in a way that appeases specifically white middle class or upper class men, which is, you know what, I'm not going to cuss, which is not valid. Okay, that's not a valid argument. Strong women, strong Black women, strong Latina women can be in roles of management, can be in roles of power, and be valid in not having a meek and submissive demeanor. Because if the same characteristics were in a white man, they'd be praised. So stop telling people how to be more friendly or smile more or to have better customer service, and start catering to the inequalities that create the frustration, that create a need to be assertive or what have you. And then start recognizing what skills are just human skills and work for specific jobs and why. I am an incredibly assertive person. I am an incredibly educated person. I'm an incredibly talkative and loud and boisterous person. And all of those things make me a damn good teacher. Okay. There's a reason for that, right? Now, if I was sitting, and I have been in managerial roles where, say, my bosses were white men, or my bosses, or I was the only female in a entire group of other male managers, I'm going to be seen as the bitch. I'm going to be seen as this person who is way overly assertive. And when you add racial dynamics to that too, it gets expounded upon. And what happens is you create these situations where you deny people success based on their lack of submitting to your own personal ideas that you should be dominant. And that's BS. Like, do better. All right. And then the growing number of Black celebrities prove that racial wealth gap is closing. Also, okay. So just celebrities in general are such a minute part of the population that comparing them to the general population of whatever demographic it is, whether it be women, whether it be white people, whether it be men, whether it be Black, Asian, Latino, no matter what it is, celebrities are such a minute portion of the population that they are never a realistic demonstration of the vast majority of that population. So you could look at, say, Black women who are celebrities. Those celebrities are not going to be the vast majority of lived experiences of Black women as a whole, especially not when you talk about economics. Okay. And again, that's like saying that top 1% is the same as everyone else when they're clearly not. So that comparison doesn't hold weight when it comes to talking about closing and providing racial wealth equality and closing that wealth gap for everyone as a whole. All right, so Black family disorganization is the cause of racial wealth gap. This is, again, another version of victim blaming, and it's victim blaming that doesn't accredit the way in which mass incarceration and other processes of dysregulation for Black communities, especially with Black men, have disrupted community values and have created and or taken Black men out of communities at a level which is just astronomically high for things that they would not, if they were not Black and male, they would not be having the same um, level of disenfranchisement. So there's a reason why Black men are overwhelmingly the mass incarcerated, and none of that has to do with the fact that they create crime on a much higher level. And we'll get into that when we move into kind of the next module. So I'm going to leave a lot of that particular soapbox for that level. But so that's kind of where we're going to stop for chapter 10. I hope that this kind of got you some really good information, and I hope that we can continue to have really good conversations about how economics play into other institutions and how these institutions play into economic inequality.